Welcome to Lost Relation Chronicles.
Detective Albert Fisher couldn't believe his luck. After 3 days of tramping through a deep, dense forest, he finally found his quarry. He was plodding up another endless hill and getting tired of fighting his way through tangled bush while contending with hordes of mosquitoes and bugs when he spotted something out of the ordinary. A flash of color or a sudden movement. He wasn't sure which, but something caught his eye. He focused his attention on it. Yes, definitely something down there, but wild animal or human. He wasn't sure, so he continued to study for a moment. He suddenly realized he was on a crest of a hill and therefore perfectly silhouetted, a perfect target for his quarry if indeed it was human. Instinctively, he dropped to the ground, crawled up behind some bushes which he hoped would give him some cover. Then he peered intently down the hill for a few minutes before making his decision. It was him all right. Timothy Lee, the object of the 3-day manhunt. It was reported that he kidnapped his wife and fled into the mountainous wilderness near Edson, Alberta. The search for him had come to involve dozens of policemen and civilian searchers. Now, Fisher thought, I think we finally got him. Still staying crouched behind the bushes, Fisher could hear the searchers coming up behind him. Earlier, they had formed a line about 25 yards apart, so Lee couldn't slip through them. However, the rugged terrain, along with tangled bush and occasional ponds, had soon thrown that plan to hell. Some, like himself, had managed to forge almost straight ahead while others had fought their way through various impediments until the straight, well-managed line had totally disintegrated. Nevertheless, they were still coming and making a hell of a lot of noise in the process. Fisher realized if Lee hadn't become aware of their presence yet, he would have to be blind, deaf, and dumb. Fisher whispered softly into his mic to contact the search coordinator, Ryan Volkov. Found him, he informed the police captain. Tell the searchers to stand down or something, will you? He suggested. I don't think Lee is completely aware of us, yet so there is still a chance we can take him by surprise and end this peacefully. Like hell, came the response from Volkov, making Fisher wince. Same old captain, a good man, but as gung-ho as all hell, with the philosophy of aggression and brute force being the only way to subdue a suspect. Scare the hell out of them. Show them who's boss and that we're not going to back down, especially when it comes to kidnappers. That was Volkov's idea of diplomacy. Where he is? Volkov demanded. I need to have my men surrounding him right now to make sure the sucker doesn't escape us. Fisher sighed in frustration, arguing he realized was useless. Volkov was in command, and Lee probably posed at least some danger. There was no denying that, but still he had hoped for at least a chance to get Lee out of this mess alive. In a valley about 100 yards straight ahead, good hiding place he's found himself. He's deep in some bushes with lots of open space between him and us, so he'll be able to spot us the moment we make a move on him. Fisher cursed at the captain's response. No problem. We surround him and find a place for the snipers to get a good beat on him, and then he either surrenders immediately or else. Fisher's reply was interrupted by someone crawling up behind him. He turned his head and saw that a policewoman named Kathy Robinson was wriggling her way toward him. Any sign of the woman? She asked when she reached him. Fisher blinked at the question and then cursed himself for being so stupid. The woman, of course, Maria Lee, the whole object of this search. Where the hell was she? He and the captain had been so occupied with the fate of Timothy Lee, they had completely forgotten about her. The woman, Robinson demanded. You see her down there? Then, with a knowing smirk, added men, so full of testosterone, they fight and argue among themselves and lose sight of the most important things. She pulled a pair of binoculars from a bag around her waist and turned her attention to the spot where Lee had been seen. Anyways, there he is. That's Timothy, all right, she exclaimed, but where is Maria? Hope he didn't ditch her or already kill her. Fisher watched as she refocused the binoculars and began a sweep of the area around Timothy. Think I spotted her, she said after a moment's search. Where? Asked Fisher. Something about 25 yards from Timothy, about 3 o'clock. Lying in some bushes, shape of a body, so it's probably her, but she doesn't appear to be moving much. Hope she's still okay. Fisher nodded and said, may I? He grabbed the binoculars and focused them on the spot Robinson had pointed out. Sure enough, body down there, and there is some movement, so maybe she is still okay. He handed the glasses back to Robinson and told her, keep an eye on them, I gotta talk to the captain again. Fisher, what the hell's happening? The captain hissed. The woman Robinson found her, spotted her with binoculars. He explained as Robinson glanced sideways at him, with a frown on her face. Good, Volkov replied. Now that we know where she is, we take Timothy quickly, one way or the other, before he can do anything else to her. Let's wrap this up and go home. In the valley below, Maria Lee lay prone among some dense bushes. She had heard the approach of the searchers and knew her ordeal would soon be over. However, it wasn't the couple of days' march through the bush that she was referring to. It was all the shit and abuse she had been forced to put up with since her marriage to Timothy. At first, she had been captivated by his bad boy image, and it seemed exciting to be around him, but that wore about as fast as the honeymoon fantasy did. Timothy, she quickly discovered, was a narcissistic son of a bitch who cared only about himself, and in addition, had no qualms about heaping all kinds of physical and emotional abuse on her. Over several years, her friends first noticed the change in her demeanor due to the emotional abuse. Then they saw the more telltale signs of outright physical abuse. Maria had made several complaints to the police, but the results were less than satisfactory. All Timothy got was a warning to behave himself. Finally, she had not only divorced Timothy, but got a restraining order against him. However, the order meant nothing to him, and he broke it on a regular basis without much repercussion from the law. It was only after enduring this for a couple more years that Maria and a couple of girlfriends devised a plan to put an end to the Timothy problem permanently. They had set the first part of the plan in motion Friday afternoon by renting a lake shore cabin for the long weekend. Normally, Maria went to great lengths to hide her whereabouts from Timothy in order to avoid another confrontation with him. However, this time she made no attempt to hide from him, so she knew Timothy was bound to show up, and he didn't disappoint her. The rest was easy, but the most risky part of the plan, especially for Maria. The women plied the unsuspecting Timothy with booze laced with drugs, then alternately cajoled, threatened, acted friendly and angry to him, until he became a befuddled creature that finally snapped. While the girlfriends fled in panic to alert the authorities about a kidnapping, Maria remained behind, so she could feed Timothy more of the doctored booze, which made him extremely pliable and easy to manipulate. She talked him into a walk in woods to calm down, and the rest, as they say, was history. For the next couple of days, she continued to ply Timothy with the booze and drugs and lead him around in circles through the dense bush until the police found them. As for Timothy, drunk and stoned as he was, he could hear the approach of the posse, and he vaguely sensed that something wasn't quite right. He could feel the danger, but thoughts of Maria kept running through his addled mind. The last few days, she had actually seemed to love him again, and even though she was not anywhere near him right now, he could still feel the warmth of her body and hear her words ringing in his ears. "Don't let them take me, Timothy. Please, don't let them take me." Maria had repeated the words so often. His booze and drug-filled brain now actually believed that she was in danger, and he was going to do his best to protect her. He stumbled around in a doped-up trance, aiming a shotgun at the intruders. He couldn't see them, but he could hear them coming, and they seemed to be all around him. They had come to take Maria from him, and nothing was going to stand between them again. "You see that, Fisher?" came a whispered question from his mic. It was Volkov again. "The son of a bitch has got a gun, and he's waving it around like he intends to use it. My men are almost in position, and we're going to take him down in a moment." Fisher looked over at Robinson, who was still peering through the binoculars. "Yeah, he's got a gun, all right. Victim is still lying in the bushes about 20 yards away. She hasn't moved at all, so Volkov's crew can probably take the suspect without a problem." She heard Fisher swear. "Where the hell did he get that from?" She replied, "I don't know, but a gun makes a huge difference. If we don't take him now, there's no telling what he'll do with it." Kaboom! Kaboom! Robinson's explanation was suddenly interrupted by the sound of the shotgun firing. Both she and Fisher pushed themselves face first into the dirt as the first shot threw up clumps of grass and bushes several yards in front of them. The next one was higher, but fortunately too high. The shotgun pellets went into the trunk of a tree they were hiding under, making leaves, bark, and branches rain down on them. Before they could even gather their wits together, there came the sounds of return gunfire from Volkov's men. Fisher raised his head just in time to see Timothy go down. For a moment, Timothy looked as if he was performing some kind of hip-hop dance as the bullets tore into him. The force of them coming from all directions practically turning him around in a circle before he fell motionless to the ground. Then there was complete pandemonium as the posse suddenly rose from their positions and began to race down the hill and across the open space. Some were headed straight to where Maria had been spotted, while others raced toward the freshly fallen Timothy. Fisher and Robinson were a little slow off the mark, so they were the last to arrive. Fisher went immediately to where Volkov and his men stood in a circle, staring down at the lifeless body of Timothy, while Robinson headed towards the victim. After Fisher studied the bullet-ridden body of Timothy, he looked up at Volkov, who was standing at his head with a big grin on his face. Dressed from head to toe in camouflage clothing, he looked like a big game hunter who had just bagged the ultimate trophy. Fisher wasn't so sure. Maybe it was because he didn't like to see anybody getting senselessly killed. Maybe it was because he still thought that if he'd had a chance to talk to Timothy, then maybe things might have been different. Looks like we're done here. The son of the bitch led us on quite a chase, but we got him. Volkov was announcing to the press, which had closed in, and began snapping pictures. Fisher shook his head and moved out of the circus. He made his way over to where Robinson and several other policemen were helping the victim towards a 4x4 Jeep. They wanted to get her to the hospital as quick as possible, but the terrain proved too difficult for an ordinary vehicle, so the 4x4 would take her to the ambulance, which was waiting on the road at the edge of the forest. She hurt bad. Timothy do anything to her? Fisher asked Robinson after she had finished helping Maria onto the open tail gate of the Jeep, where a couple of medical attendants began fussing over her. No, her injuries looked superficial, mainly from being dragged through the bush for 3 days. You know, the usual scratches, bumps, and bruises. That, plus dehydration and lack of food. He didn't beat her up or sexually assault her, but she's very emotionally distraught. She claims Timothy kept wanting to reconcile their marriage, and when she disagreed, he threatened to kill her and then kill himself. Sounds like the usual bullshit. If I can't have you, then nobody can. Since there wasn't anybody around to dispute Robinson's observation, it became the official version of the event. Fisher nodded and looked over at the Jeep where Maria sat on the tailgate, surrounded by the medics. He thought Robinson was probably right. The woman looked none the worse for wear for her ordeal. One medic was busy combing grass and leaves out of her hair and tending to a couple of scratches on her sunburnt face, while the other was dabbing ointment and applying bandages to cuts and bruises on her arms and legs. Back in town, most of the search crew crowded into a bar to tell and retell their stories about the search for Timothy over a bunch of beer. However, both Robinson and Fisher begged off. Robinson said she was anxious to get home to her kids after not seeing them for 3 days, while Fisher said he wanted to get started on the report while it was still fresh in his mind. After dropping Robinson off at her car, Fisher drove to his place, stripped off his clothes, took a long, hot shower, then shaved off his 3-day growth of beard and changed into a clean pair of khaki trousers and polo shirt. On one hand, he was happy that the whole thing had ended with Maria being found relatively unscathed. On the other hand, he had his doubts. Something kept bothering him. The whole thing seemed too pat with the fate of Timothy already decided in advance, as if his death was preordained and nobody gave a care. After all, he was a no-good son of a bitch, and everybody was happy to see him get what he deserved. That was the problem. Maria, the much-abused ex-wife, made the perfect victim and the abusive son of a bitch. Timothy made the perfect villain. His going down in a hail of bullets was also the perfect ending, because it satisfied everybody and left only the victim's statement for the police to go on with nothing to corroborate it. Maybe he was just being a cynic, but detectives got paid for being cynics, and after some of the things he had seen during his years as a policeman, he believed humans were capable of doing almost anything. First thing in the morning, he would do a little more investigation before he wrote his report. In the meantime, he was hungry. Fisher looked in his fridge and didn't like what he saw. Most of the stuff seemed to be several weeks old and didn't look in the least appetizing, so he got in his car and headed to his favorite place, Armstrong's. It was owned by a red-headed Irishman, and it boasted an original Irish stew on its menu. The owner claimed it was from a family recipe handed down for generations. Fisher didn't know whether or not it was true. He only knew he liked it so much that the stew, along with several thick crusts of bread washed down with Irish beer, were almost a daily fare for him. Usually Fisher had his stew and a couple of beer, then left, but tonight was different, mainly because he got tied up at the pool table with some young hot shot who challenged him to a game which he almost won. The youngster kept buying him beer, while urging him to play game after game, and then taking his money because he never seemed to be able to beat the kid. No matter how close the game looked, the kid always seemed to pull some unbelievable shot. As a result, Fisher awoke the next morning at home with almost no idea how he got there. His head pounded, and his stomach kept threatening to divulge itself of the Irish stew, but somehow he managed to get himself mobile. Still, it took several minutes under the shower before he was able to rouse himself enough to get his clothes on and head out the door. Then he realized his car wasn't parked in its usual spot. He found it after taking a cab back to Armstrong's, and then he headed downtown with several things on his mind. The number one thing was a little more investigation into the untimely death of Timothy. The other was ability of one person being able to con another so good that even when the person being conned saw it coming. He never really saw it coming. Too many con men and too many hustlers in this world, Fisher mused. He mentally tallied up the amount of money he had lost last night. Shit, the kid took me for a couple of hundred and I fell right into it and kept coming back for more. As Fisher pulled into a parking lot at the police station, he kept wondering if Maria Lee was also pulling a con. "Christ, you look like shit this morning. Too much partying last night," Sherry Anderson, the secretary, teased him as he passed her desk. Sherry was a 30-ish, tall, slender brunette with a very pretty face. She was always friendly to him, and Fisher thought she might have a crush on him. He kept promising himself that one day he was going to see if his premonition was right, but he had never gotten around it. "Feel like it too," he replied. "Only I don't know which is worse, the hangover or the fact that some hotshot pool players sucked me out of a couple $100 last night. The kid was so good that I never saw it coming, even though I told myself to be careful. This guy might be a hustler." Sherry laughed and replied, "Oh yeah, sucker born every minute. Isn't that how it goes?" She pulled out a desk drawer and grabbed a bottle of aspirin. "Here, have a couple of these," she said as she shook a few tablets into his offered hand. "Maybe the next time you decide to have a night on the town, you should do it with somebody who plays a whole lot nicer," she added as she gave him a wink and a big smile. Ordinarily, Fisher might have flirted right back at her, but this morning he just wasn't in the mood for it. Later, he promised himself as he made his way to his cubicle and grabbed yesterday's reports. He scanned through them quickly, and it was just as he suspected. The police involved in the pursuit and death of Timothy Lee all came to the same conclusion. They had successfully tracked down and killed the man who had kidnapped and threatened to kill his ex-wife. Fisher realized his report wouldn't be much different unless he could find some discrepancies somewhere. He threw the aspirins into his mouth and washed them down with a cup of hot, black coffee. Maybe the aspirins did help, or it could be the hot coffee. Fisher wasn't sure which, but he definitely felt a bit better. He left the police station and headed over to the coroner's office. Fisher sipped on another hot coffee and munched on a donut while reading the coroner's report. Same as everybody else's, he saw. Timothy died from numerous gunshot wounds to the torso and head, and it was too difficult to say which one actually did him in. In total, there were 6 shots that hit him, coroner Dr. Alexander Novikov explained, and any one could have been fatal. "What about drugs and booze?" "From what I saw, Timothy sure acted like he was so stoned and drunk that he probably didn't even realize what he was doing. Yeah, lots of booze in his system, both whiskey and vodka, and enough drugs to kill a horse. He was so full of uppers, downers, and in-betweeners, it's a wonder he was still on his feet, let alone be able to fire a shotgun at you." "I hear he came close to hitting you and Robinson," the coroner replied. "Lucky shot to be even close." Fisher shrugged it off. Timothy was so stoned and drunk he couldn't have hit the side of a barn door. Now for the million-dollar question, Fisher thought as he posed his question to the coroner. "That much drugs and booze. Is it normal for somebody intent on kidnapping a woman to take so much of that stuff it makes him practically unable to function? Kind of defeats the purpose of the whole thing, doesn't it? I mean, wouldn't a normal person want to be able to keep his wits about him, so he'd be able to evade the police and avoid being killed?" The coroner was silent for a moment as she pondered Fisher's question. Then she replied, "Yeah, I see your point, but you're talking normal person when a kidnapper is anything but normal. Who knows what's going through a person's mind when he kidnaps somebody, especially somebody who he believes still loves him. The poor guy was probably total delusional to begin with, and the drugs and booze just make it worse. In the end, he probably felt that since he's going to end it all anyway, what better way to go than a shootout with the cops?" "What? Suicide by police?" Fisher asked, and the coroner nodded in agreement. "You gotta understand, Fisher, that these guys are probably nutcases from the get-go, and then they just snap. From then on, everything makes perfect sense to them." By the time Fisher left the coroner's office, he was convinced that the death of Timothy was going to be ruled what everybody wanted it to be. Death by police after he refused to surrender his kidnapped victim and surrender to the police. The blast from the shotgun made it even more believable that the police had no choice but to shoot him. Fisher knew he had one chance left to get to the bottom of everything, and that was to confront the victim herself and see what she had to say about the ordeal. It was a long shot, but Fisher felt he had to take it. He phoned Maria Lee's at her house, and she gave him her address. Fisher had no trouble finding the place. It was a trendy apartment-style condo, and of course there was no place to park near it, so he stuck his official police business sticker on the dashboard and parked in a no-parking zone. Maria buzzed him in immediately, and he took the elevator up to her third-floor apartment. Fisher paused at her door before knocking, because he could hear voices which meant she had company. It was a disappointment, because he was hoping to find her alone, but he decided to confront her whether or not she had visitors. "Come on in, the door's open," a female voice hollered in response to his knock, and Fisher entered the apartment. It had an open concept design, with a kitchen nook immediately to the left, and a living room straight ahead where Maria sat on a sofa in the company of 2 female friends. "Why, Detective? So nice for you to join us. You care for something?" Maria asked as from her position on the sofa. Sorry I can't get up, but my leg is bothering me. She was stretched out with her feet on a hassock, one of which bore a couple of bandages. There were also some small scratches on her sun-burnt face. Fisher's immediate thought was that she was recovering pretty damned quick from her 3-day forced march through the forest. Meet my friends Susan and Sylvia. They have been so wonderful in helping me get over my ordeal. This morning, they decided to come over and keep me company since I'm a shut-in. The doctor says to stay off my foot for a couple of days. After last night, Fisher's stomach felt a bit queasy at just the smell of the liquor. Maria waved under his nose, but then it really didn't matter. He was here on business, not pleasure, and there was no way he was going to drink with her, especially with the suspicions he had about her and her friends. He merely nodded at the women before turning his attention back to Maria. "Why, Ms. Lee, I sure am glad to see you recovered so quickly from your ordeal," Fisher replied with a hint of sarcasm in his voice. He didn't show any sympathy for her, and he wanted it that way to try and make her feel intimidated enough to foolishly say something she hadn't intended to. "Oh, I thought you realized I wasn't that seriously injured, at least physically, but emotionally that's a whole different story. The doctors say I was so emotionally abused that it may take some time before I'm okay, and right now I feel as if I can never trust another man again. After all, the son of a bitch did threaten to kill me, you know?" Fisher saw her girlfriends nodding in sympathy and decided to pull no punches because he felt he had nothing to lose and it was one last chance with everything into the pot. "Oh yeah, I understand. Timothy did abuse you. He threatened to kill you, all right, and he was probably a real son of a bitch. We can all agree on that. But the question I have is, did you have to set him up to be killed? Wasn't there some other way to end this?" Fisher knew he had lost when Maria was able to look right back at him without even so much as blinking. The woman had balls, that's for such, he concluded. Maria just took another sip of her drink and replied, "What I don't understand, detective, is why you are still investigating this case at all. Did you know that Captain Volkov told me it's closed as far as he's concerned? Isn't it just great that I don't have to worry about Timothy anymore? That's because it's not really closed as far as I'm concerned. You see, I think the case isn't completely airtight because there's still a few things missing, and that leaves it with a few gaps. You understand what that means? It means that I'll watching you and your friend for a while yet, so you'd better not slip up on anything or I'll be there to pounce on you." Maria sipped her drink again and smiled at Fisher. "Thanks for the warning, detective, but haven't you heard the saying about the wisdom of having gaps in airtight things?" Fisher was ready to leave, but he delayed his departure a moment, waiting for the answer. "The gaps are good because they let a little sunshine in." Fisher turned to leave, ignoring the gales of laughter from the women. He now was only sure of one thing. God help the next man who pissed one of those women off. 3 months later, the case was closed. Timothy, being the unfortunate victim here, was the culprit. Detective Fisher knew how he was killed, but after checking the entire timelines, decided to bury the case. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comment section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.